Chapter 6, Completing the Table with a Bang. As you learned in Chapter 4, a supernova gave our solar system every natural element, and the churning of young molten planets made sure those elements were well blended in the rocky soil. But that alone cannot tell us everything about the distribution of elements on Earth. Since the supernova, whole species of elements have gone extinct because their nuclei, their cores of protons and neutrons, were too fragile to survive in nature. This left holes in the periodic table, holes that, unlike in Mendeleev's time, scientists couldn't fill, no matter how hard they searched. They eventually did fill in the table, but only after developing whole new technologies that let them create elements on their own, and only after realizing that the fragility of some elements conceals a bright, shiny danger. Tidying up the table. The roots of this story go back to the University of Manchester in England just before World War I. Manchester had assembled some brilliant scientists, including lab director Ernest Rutherford. Perhaps the most promising student was Henry Moseley. Moseley grew enthusiastic about studying elements by blasting them with electron beams, although Rutherford objected to the work as a waste of time. In 1913, Moseley began to probe every discovered element up to gold, element 79. As we know today, when a beam of electrons strikes an atom, the beam knocks out the atom's own electrons, leaving a hole that the other electrons rush to fill. All this crashing about causes the release of high-energy X-rays. Excitingly, Moseley found a mathematical relationship between the wavelength of the X-rays, the number of protons that an element has in its nucleus, and the element's atomic number, its spot on the periodic table. Since Mendeleev had published his famous table in 1869, it had undergone a number of changes. Mendeleev had set his first table sideways until someone showed him the sense in rotating it 90 degrees. Over the next 40 years, chemists continued to mess with the table, adding columns and reshuffling elements, but some problems just wouldn't go away. Most of the elements lined up on the table in a simple order of increasing weight. According to that method, nickel, element 28, should come before cobalt. But to make the elements fit properly so that cobalt sat above cobalt-like elements and that nickel sat above nickel-like elements, chemists had to switch their spots. No one knew why this was necessary, and it was just one of several annoying cases. To get around this problem, scientists invented the atomic number as a placeholder, but no one really knew what the atomic number actually meant. Moseley, just 25 years old, solved the riddle by translating the question from chemistry to physics. The crucial thing to realize is that very few scientists believed in the atomic nucleus at the time. Moseley linked an element's place on the table to a physical characteristic, saying that the positive nuclear charge was the same as the atomic number. This proved the ordering of elements was not random, but arose from a proper understanding of atoms. Screwy cases, such as cobalt and nickel, suddenly made sense, since the lighter nickel had more protons and therefore a higher positive charge, and therefore had to come after cobalt. After Moseley, there was no more need to fudge explanations. Furthermore, like Bunsen's spectroscope, Moseley's electron gun helped tidy up the periodic table by sorting through a confusing list of radioactive isotopes, atoms of the same element with different numbers of neutrons and different weights, and disproving incorrect claims for new elements. Moseley also found 4 remaining holes in the table, elements 43, 61, 72, and 75. The elements heavier than gold were too expensive to obtain proper samples to experiment on in 1913. Had Moseley been able to, he would have found gaps at 85, 87, and 91 too. Element hunters. Tragically, Moseley was killed in World War I in 1915. He had enlisted in the King's Army against the Army's advice. The best tribute that scientists could pay to Moseley was to hunt down all the missing elements he'd pointed out. Indeed, Moseley so inspired element hunters, who suddenly had a clear idea of what to search for, that element safaris became almost too popular. Scuffles soon arose over who'd first discovered hafnium, element 72, protactinium, element 91, and technetium. Other research groups filled in the gaps at elements 85 and 87 in the late 1930s by creating elements in the lab. By 1940, only one natural element, one prize, remained undiscovered, element 61. Oddly, though, only a few research teams around the world were bothering to look for it. One team, led by an Italian physicist named Emilio Segre, tried to create an artificial sample and almost succeeded in 1942, but they gave up after a few attempts to isolate it. It wasn't until 7 years later that 3 scientists from Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee announced that after sifting through some old uranium ore, they had discovered element 61. After a few hundred years of chemistry, the last hole in the periodic table had been filled. Surprisingly, the announcement of the discovery of 61 didn't create much excitement, despite the name that it received, promethium. A mid-range element like promethium could no longer get people worked up like the heavy elements plutonium and uranium, not to mention their famous offspring, the atomic bomb. To understand how subatomic particles behave, scientists had to devise a whole new mathematical tool called quantum mechanics, and it took years to figure out how to apply it to even the simplest hydrogen atoms. Meanwhile, scientists were beginning to understand more about the related field of radioactivity, the study of how nuclei fall apart. Any old atom can lose or gain electrons, but great scientists, such as Marie Curie or Ernest Rutherford, realized that some rare elements could change their nuclei, their protons and neutrons too. Rutherford helped classify these changes into just a few common types, which he named using the Greek alphabet, calling them alpha, beta, or gamma decay. Gamma decay is the simplest and deadliest. It occurs when the nucleus emits X-rays and is today the stuff of nuclear nightmares. In beta decays, atoms released electrons, while in alpha decay, they released chunks of the nucleus. Beta and alpha radioactivity also involve the conversion of one element to another, a tantalizing process in the 1920s. But each element goes radioactive in a characteristic way, so scientists were confused and increasingly frustrated about the nature of isotopes as well. The giant collective forehead slap, the "of course" moment, took place in 1932, when James Chadwick, yet another of Rutherford's students, discovered the neutral neutron, which adds weight to the nucleus without adding charge. Coupled with Moseley's explanation of atomic number, atoms suddenly made more sense. The neutron meant that you could have different forms of an element. They would have different atomic weights, but would still have the same positive nuclear charge and sit in the same box on the periodic table. The nature of radioactivity suddenly made sense too. Beta decay was understood as a conversion of neutrons to protons, and it's because the proton number changes that beta decay converts an atom into a different element. Alpha decay also converts elements and is the most dramatic change on a nuclear level. 2 neutrons and 2 protons are taken away. Neutrons also help scientists understand a new type of reaction. Elements, especially lighter elements, try to maintain a rough 1-to-1 ratio of neutrons to protons. If an atom has too many neutrons, it splits itself, releasing energy and excess neutrons in the process. Nearby atoms can then absorb those neutrons, at which point they become unstable and split. This split releases more energy and more neutrons, which makes even more atoms unstable, so that they split and release still more energy. If you release enough energy, this process, called a chain reaction, will result in a nuclear explosion. Just as the basic understanding of electrons, protons, and neutrons fell into place, the old world political order was disintegrating and World War II was about to begin. With their new model of atoms, scientists began to see that the few undiscovered elements on the periodic table were undiscovered because they were unstable. They decayed away. Even if they had existed in abundance on the early Earth, they had long since disintegrated. This conveniently explained the holes in the periodic table. Probing unstable elements soon led scientists to stumble onto nuclear fission and neutron chain reactions. And as soon as they understood that atoms could be split, fission, simply collecting new elements for display seemed like an amateur's hobby. Which is why, with a world war and the possibility of atomic bombs staring at them in 1939, no scientist bothered tracking promethium down until a decade later. The Monte Carlo method. No matter how excited scientists got about the possibility of fission bombs, however, a lot of work still separated the theory from the reality. It's hard to remember today, but nuclear bombs were considered a long shot at best, especially by military experts. Figuring out how to divide atoms in a controlled manner proved so difficult and so far beyond the science of the day that the U.S. government research into nuclear weapons, the Manhattan Project, had to adopt a whole new strategy to succeed, the Monte Carlo method. This method involved running simulations on paper instead of actually doing experiments, and it eventually changed what, quote, doing science meant. As noted, quantum mechanics worked fine for very simple atoms, and by 1940 scientists knew that absorbing a neutron made an atom explode and possibly release more neutrons. Following the path of one given neutron was easy, no harder than following a soccer ball on a field. But imagine trying to follow 100 or even 1,000 soccer balls bouncing around all at once. It's much harder. Following chain reactions were even worse, because that required following billions and billions of neutrons, all of them traveling at different speeds in every direction. At the same time, uranium and plutonium were expensive and dangerous, so detailed experimental work was out of the question. Manhattan Project scientists had orders to figure out exactly how much plutonium and uranium were needed to create a bomb. Too little, and the bomb would fizzle out. Too much, and the bomb would blow up just fine, but at the cost of prolonging the war by months, since both elements were monstrously complicated to purify, or, in plutonium's case, make, then purify. So just to get by, some scientists decided to forget the usual approaches of theory or experiment and find a new, third scientific method. Basically, scientists used millions of pencil and paper calculations to collect only virtual data, not data from real experiments, for the plutonium and uranium bombs. Of course, such calculations were only as good as the scientists' equations, but here they got lucky. The sheer number of calculations scientists pushed through during the Manhattan Project gave them great confidence. Confidence that was proved justified after the first successful nuclear bomb test in New Mexico in mid-1945. Then the swift and flawless detonation of a uranium bomb over Hiroshima and a plutonium bomb over Nagasaki a few days later also testified to the accuracy of this unconventional, calculation-based approach to science. After the Manhattan Project ended, scientists scattered back to their homes to reflect on what they'd done, some proudly, some not. Many gladly forgot about their time in the project. Some, though, were excited by what they learned, including one Stanislaw Ulam. Ulam, a Polish refugee who'd passed hours in New Mexico playing card games, was playing solitaire one day in 1946 when he began wondering about the odds of winning any randomly dealt hand. Ulam recognized that he was using the same basic approach as scientists had used in the bomb-building experiments in Los Alamos. Discussion soon followed with his calculation-loving friend, John von Neumann, another European refugee and Manhattan Project scientist. Ulam and von Neumann realized just how powerful the method might be if they could apply it to other situations. Unlike with an experiment, the results were not certain, but with enough calculations, they could be pretty sure of the probabilities. So-called Monte Carlo science, since it was based on the probability used in the famous casinos, caught on quickly. It cut down on expensive experiments, and the need for high-quality Monte Carlo simulators, which ran equations instead of experiments, drove the early development of computers, pushing them to become faster and more efficient. Types of nuclear bombs. In those early days, Ulam's Monte Carlo method mostly pushed through the next generation of nuclear weapons. Von Neumann and Ulam would show up at the gymnasium-sized rooms where computers were set up and mysteriously ask if they could run a few programs, starting at midnight and running until morning. The weapons they developed during those dead hours were the supers, multi-stage nuclear bombs 1,000 times more powerful than standard A-bombs. After a great struggle to find the proper design for a super, scientists finally found one in 1952. The Eniwetok Atoll, a small group of islands in the Pacific Ocean, was wiped out during a test of a super, showing once again the ruthless brilliance of the Monte Carlo method. Nevertheless, bomb scientists had already had something even worse than the supers in the pipeline. Atomic bombs can get you two ways. A madman who just wants a lot of people dead and lots of buildings flattened can stick with a conventional bomb. It's easier to build, and the big flashbang and after effects, such as spontaneous tornadoes and the silhouettes of victims seared onto brick walls, will do the job. But if the madman has patience and wants to do something much more terrifying, then he'll detonate a Cobalt-60 dirty bomb. Conventional nuclear bombs kill with heat, but dirty bombs kill with gamma radiation, dangerous X-rays. As well as burning people frightfully, gamma rays dig down into bone marrow and scramble the chromosomes in white blood cells. The cells either die outright, grow cancerous, or grow uncontrollably and end up deformed and unable to fight infections. All nuclear bombs release some radiation, but with dirty bombs, the terrifying radiation is the whole point. Another European refugee who worked on the Manhattan Project, Leo Szilard, calculated in 1950 that sprinkling 1/10 of an ounce of Cobalt-60 on every square mile of Earth would pollute it with enough gamma rays to wipe out the human race. His bomb consisted of a multi-stage warhead surrounded by a jacket of Cobalt-59. In the bomb, cobalt atoms would collect neutrons from fission and fusion, a step called salting. The salting would convert stable Cobalt-59 into unsteady Cobalt-60, which would then float down like ash. Lots of other elements emit gamma rays, but there's something special about cobalt. Regular A-bombs can be waited out in underground shelters, since most of the radioactive atoms they release end up decaying quickly. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were more or less safe within days of the 1945 explosions. Other elements absorb extra neutrons and also turn radioactive, but because they decay so slowly after the initial blast, radiation levels never climb too high. Cobalt bombs fall between those extremes. Cobalt-60 atoms would settle into the ground like tiny landmines. Enough would go off right away to make it necessary to flee, that after 5 years, half of the cobalt would still be waiting to release deadly radiation. The steady pulse of gamma rays would mean the cobalt bombs could neither be waited out nor endured. It would take a whole human lifetime for the land to recover. This actually makes cobalt bombs useless weapons for war, because a conquering army couldn't occupy the land that they had devastated, since it would be too dangerous. But a madman, intent only on wiping out the human race, wouldn't care about that. Szilard hoped his cobalt bomb, the first doomsday device, would never be built. And no country, as far as the public knows, has ever tried. In fact, Szilard came up with the idea to show the insanity of nuclear war. Before Szilard, nuclear weapons were horrifying, but not necessarily so frightening that they could result in the end of the world. After showing the world the Cobalt-60 bomb, Szilard hoped that people would know better and give up nukes. Hardly. Not long after the haunting name Promethium became official, the Soviet Union acquired the bomb too. The U.S. and Soviet governments soon accepted the less than reassuring but aptly named idea of MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD. The idea that, whatever happened during a nuclear war, both sides would lose because of the devastation left behind. However crazy MAD seemed, it did stop people from using nukes as tactical weapons. Instead, international tensions gave birth to the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, a struggle that so affected all of our society then not even the beautiful periodic table could escape.